Hey everybody, welcome to Pilgrims in a Holy Land. I have with me today Cindy Beaver and Mike Chu, and we are going to be talking about Christmas music today. So welcome Cindy and Mike.
Hi, Carey.
Hi, Carey.
How are you guys doing?
Getting in the
Getting
home.
ready for the Christmas season.
Yeah, I get a little bit tired when I get all of the questions all the time of, are you ready for Christmas? I'm like, what does that even mean? I don't know what that's supposed to mean. Like, in a way that I'm always ready for Christmas because I like Christmas and I just want it to come. Like, I don't have this set of things that I feel like I have to do. I mean, there is that set of things because I have kids and they have expectations. But aside from that, that's really the only thing that matters to me.
It's not the list of these cookies to bake and these cards to get out and the tree to decorate in the house and all the other things and get haircuts so you look good at church and all those things.
Yeah, of course, if you have sermons to do, that is something you do have to prepare.
This guy
Yeah.
totally working on my sermon this coming Sunday, so
That's okay. You have days to do that.
I have days.
Yeah. Well, I thought we would just get together and talk about Christmas music because a lot of times we don't think about the songs that we're singing, especially if they're traditional songs. Like, we sing the lyrics and we might be in love with a certain song, but we're not really sure. We don't really think about the theology behind the song. And a lot of Christmas music has questionable theology. A lot of it has really good theology, and we don't think about that either. Like, so we need to have both sides of the equation, I think.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, you grow up singing and you don't even question. You learn these things even as little children. And you're just singing them and you can hear some of them either, at church for different carol things. You can hear it in a concert. Some of them you might hear on the radio, not so much the sacred ones, but some of them.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I was in the post office this week and they were playing music and it was all Christian, like Christmas carols. I was like, sweet, that's pretty awesome.
I was actually at my car dealership this morning getting oil change and tire change out for the winter coming here in the Northeast. And I'm hearing like essentially like Handel's Messiah.
Whoa.
And other music that overtly has like Christian oriented lyrics in there. So it's just interesting that during this time of year, you actually will hear Jesus being talked about in open public, but it just sort of becomes part of this background noise that everyone is just kind of soaked in. They just assume this is what you're just going to hear during the season.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's what I mean about just not even thinking about the lyrics that you're hearing, whether you're Christian, whether you're not Christian. It's just kind of that background to this time of year. And then you get the songs that are like, oh, it's all Christmas and winter and snow. And then the people in other climates are like, well, we don't get that.
Yeah, Tim Stedman down in Australia. Yeah, not happening.
Yeah, no snow down there.
No.
If they ever
Yeah.
did get snow down there, we know something's going on.
Yeah. Especially this time of year.
Well, I thought we'd actually start with talking about what might be called the first Christmas song, where we have Mary's Magnificat. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put it up on the screen and read it. This is from the ESV, and this is where Mary is talking to her cousin Elizabeth, and she's rejoicing in her pregnancy and in the fact that she is going to bear Jesus. So this is in Luke 1, verses 46 through 55, and it says, "And Mary said, 'My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked on the humble estate of his servant. For behold, from now on all generations will call me blessed. For he who is mighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name. And his mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, as he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham and to his offspring forever. So that was Mary's song that she sang when she was in Elizabeth's house. And there's a lot of parallels to the Old Testament, like just parallel after parallel after parallel in this song.
Yep, you've got Hannah when
Mhm.
she had begged to have a child and ran into Eli, who at first thought that she was just a drunken idiot sitting there crying in her soup, so to speak, at the temple, until he realizes, oh, no, she is grieving that she is unable to have a child. And then how she has that child and dedicates Samuel, who will become the prophet that anoints both Saul and David. And so that's a very, very special echo of how, and a connection with how Jesus too will be, dedicated to the Lord. His life and his ministry will be focused on educating and trying to get Israel to follow the right path.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that all of the parallels in this, well, parallels to the Old Testament and also parallels within the passage itself. Because even though she probably wasn't speaking Hebrew, like her song is very Semitic in its structure. I'm going to bring it up here again. Where in Hebrew poetry you have parallelism, which you have two or more lines that parallel one another, and that means that you've got the second line is very similar to the first line, but usually it kind of enhances it or magnifies it in a certain way, and you have a lot of that going on in this song. Like in the first two lines where she says, my soul magnifies the Lord and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, just that right there is showing that the Lord and God my Savior, those are two parallel things. So when the word Lord is used, they're usually thinking about Yahweh, because Yahweh was their Lord, right?
And they refused to say his name, and they would often just either substitute the Lord or even the word Hashem, the name.
Yeah, so when it has that parallelism, she's bringing out right from the beginning that Yahweh is her Savior and that he is also her God. This isn't really this idea of soul and spirit are two separate things and her soul is doing one thing and her spirit is doing another thing. I think rather it's just a different way of saying the same type of thing. And also really interesting to me here is the verb. Her soul is magnifying the Lord and her spirit rejoices, which, I mean, you don't think about magnifying God, right? Because he's God. Like, we don't think about how what we are doing gives glory and honor and magnificence to him. But by her very rejoicing, that's exactly what she's doing.
Well, it's also
Go ahead.
it's interesting also to me is that I think many folks may not realize, but the name Mary is the shortened version of Miriam, and so in a way she's actually following in her ancestors' steps, in that after the victory of God against Pharaoh's army in Egypt, you have Moses who has a song right on the shores, basically overwatching all that had just happened after the Reed Seed incident. and Miriam, his sister, joins in and calls on the people to also sing along. And so there's this very interesting kind of almost like this beat of Mary here, like these allusions back to the Exodus, back to the times of Moses, to the deliverer that God had sent to the people. And so there's a hint of some of these allusions and this intertextuality that's coming back again.
Absolutely. You see his mighty arm is, it says it right in there. I mean, he is definitely, he's shown his strength with his arm. He's scattered the proud. Well, what did he do with the Egyptians? He brought down the mighty from their thrones. He's filled the hungry with good things. What did he do to sustain the Israelites during their wilderness wanderings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and specifically, like what Miriam sang in her own song was in Exodus 15:21, and in the ESV she says, "Sing to the Lord," or "Sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea." Like there's this declaration of victory that's happened, and so it's interesting here. Mary hasn't even shown any sign of being pregnant. But here in this moment, she's already declaring there is a victory that is happening here in the midst. She's involved with this.
And it also shows her understanding of her role, because, I mean, honestly, a young woman that is not wedded, it was not going to be an easy life. And yet she's not, she agreed when Gabriel came to her, she agreed to become the mother of Jesus. And she knew she would pay a price or many prices. This was not going to be an easy thing to do. And yet here she's joyful about it, about the being asked to be the handmaiden of the Lord and have a special role. And people will call me blessed for generations. And they have.
Yeah, I think it's just really interesting how even before Jesus was born, there's this tradition of praise music, really, is what it was. I mean, their music back then, it's not the same as ours. It doesn't have, different part harmonies and different kinds of music instruments. Probably it was just the singing, maybe with a few instruments, but usually just singing. But it's very, very much this tradition of rejoicing and praise, and right from the beginning. I think that's pretty cool.
Yes, in the Psalms. I mean, that is their songbook, and yes, praise throughout it. Yes, there are laments and complaints and things like that, but that also just teaches us that we can bring to the Lord and have an honest conversation about this is how we feel. And yet, even at the end of those, they always turn around with praise the Lord, he hears me kind of a response.
Yeah.
Well, praise music doesn't always have to be like with a exuberant joyfulness as well. I mean, we see that with the lament psalms, the cursing psalms, but even in more modern times, even within the past century, we've seen music such as the blues, which is now like a secular version of music, but it originally was birthed within the African American church. It was this way for them to express the hardship and oppression that they have experienced as a people. And it ironically is a source of, yes, solidarity, but also a source of joy because of their ability to be able to express in song their pain, but not just pain with other people, but expressing their pain before God too. And so that is something that, music, it doesn't just have to be triumphant all the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I can't really think of many Christmas songs that have much lament in them, but there is often a theme of the breaking of chains a lot of those songs came from the Civil War in the 1800s kind of a time. And so when we're thinking of some of these songs, we're not really connecting it all the way back to the Exodus, but that's what's going on in Mary's song. And I think that's, as Christians, we probably want to be formulating that biblical imagination and thinking of that as part of our history as well. Even though we may not be Jewish, but that whole story about God's deliverance from the Pharaoh, from Egypt, and through the Red Sea, all of that kind of information is something that we should be thinking about when we're thinking about deliverance and chains breaking and all of that kind of thing.
We are children of Abraham. Paul tells us that. And so we too share that history.
And through our own experiences of hardship and pain, there is that ability for us to have a taste as well of the pain and hardship and suffering of our Lord. It's this interesting recursive experience where we get a taste of what it was like for Jesus to experience humanity and the hardship of being a human being. And at the same time, we also know he has expressed solidarity back to us. There's this very interesting dynamic that occurs when one realizes Jesus experienced humanity at its best and at its worst. And when I experience humanity at its best and its worst, I also am getting a taste of what Jesus was experiencing. So I'm actually sharing in that solidarity with him too.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think Mary's words also are speaking to not just the rescue from Egypt, but also exile and the returning home. And it's been what, 300-400, maybe even 500 years since the Babylonian exile, and yet they never quite felt that God returned, that they were forgiven. There was still something missing that they were waiting for. And so this whole feeling of expectation now, that now is the time, God is moving, he's doing something now. This is an exciting thing, and she's going to be part of it. I think that's just so wonderful.
Yeah, well, her context in the Roman Empire was that they were an oppressed people. They absolutely were.
Especially, the middle class. I don't even think there were a middle class. It was either the aristocratic rich and the poor.
Well, it's also so recently I have been reading the research of a scholar named George Athos, and he wrote this book called Bridging the Testaments. And so to me, reading this song from Mary is actually a very interesting kind of like a new little filter of lens of just seeing what's happening here, because he pointed out Mary and Joseph are from the line of David. And yet what happened in the in-between time of 400, 500 years where the dynasty of David had essentially descended down to this level where we find Mary and Joseph, descendants of David, who are now essentially plebeians. They're not slaves, but they are also not part of the power elite. They are not part of the religious class. They are not in any form of leadership. They are just part of the common people now. And like I really was so blessed by just reading and kind of getting this glimpse of like what was going on and why, for people who are in this type of environment where they had Roman oppressors, Greek oppressors in the past, Persian oppressors, they have had every century, there was never really a sense of tranquility. There was always some sort of unrest. And they actually were longing for the kingdom of David to return.
Because David's kingdom, I mean, that there was that tiny window in time when Egypt was on the decline, and Assyria and Babylon hadn't yet risen. And so that was the little niche in which the kingdom of David could have been established, could have thrived. It was just those few 100 years or so between Saul, David, and Solomon, where there was enough chaos that little kingdom could establish itself. And then the series of empires, kaboom, 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 in that area, because that is such prime real estate. 3 different continents are meeting at that time. And so it's, and I'm sure that that's intentional on God's part too, of, why the chosen, or the promised land is in that area, because it'll be so significant for spreading the message.
A few years back, I was in a Hebrew class that we were studying 1st and 2nd Samuel, and my professor is actually a Samuel scholar. Like that's just like his bread and butter. He focuses and just always keeps on studying 1st and 2nd Samuel. And we had gotten to the part where David essentially had received this promise from God that he wants to build Yahweh a house. And Yahweh's response back to him is that, no, it's great, I appreciate it, but I'm going to build you a house instead, meaning a dynasty.
Yeah.
And everything that he then describes to David about how he's not going to have war come to him from the outside, all these external things are not going to happen, that the kingdom that he is now the king of, the unified tribes, everybody, it's going to be great. And it was just this interesting moment that when after I read it, I asked my professor later after class, do you think at this moment that the promise of them becoming the kingdom of priests in Exodus 19, the treasured possession, the segula of Yahweh, that this was the closest that they ever got, that they were just on the cusp? Because when I was looking at this, it's like, well, how do you then become a kingdom of priests? How do you ensure that your entire people, from top down, that they have the ability, the means, the time to actually focus on how do we be a light to the nations? How can we intercede on behalf of other people? How can we tell people about our great God? It's like, well, you got to make sure you don't have war that's happening with you. You got to make sure that people actually can thrive, have homes, have families, be at peace, be at rest, that there's tranquility that's happening. And God is basically promising that to David. And my professor took a moment, thought for a minute, and he just looked back at me and said, yes, he thinks so. That at this rare moment in time, this was the closest Israel as a kingdom ever got to fulfilling being a kingdom of priests. And the sad thing is, the incident that occurs, the narrative that happens right after that, is Bathsheba, the incident with Bathsheba. And God's promise to David was so specific. You're not going to have war or external forces come and disturb your kingdom. He didn't say anything about the inside, though.
Mm-hmm.
And that's ultimately what broke it down.
It's almost like there's patterns in scripture or something.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah, it's, we tend to not think about all of the parallels and echoes of the Old Testament in the New Testament when we're thinking about Christmas. Like the modern Christmas songs, they're not harkening back to the Old Testament. It's all this kind of New Testament and the common imagery, the common types of sermons, things like that.
I wonder, part of it is that mentality that now that we have the New Testament, we don't need the Old Testament. And yet you can't understand the New Testament without the old.
Don't get me started. It's, it,
Yes,
I
Joshua Davidson in the comments, O come, Emmanuel is a Old Testament callback for sure.
There
Yes.
you go. Yes, yes, yes. Definitely.
it's
Okay,
it's
there's
just
one.
it's just such an interesting thing where we have this phenomenon of pastors in the modern evangelical church that are calling folks to unhitch themselves from the Old Testament. And but then when pushed against, one pastor I'm thinking in particular will then immediately say, oh, no, but yeah, the Old Testament is inspired. It's not to say that God didn't actually inspire the Old Testament. It's just that the Old Testament is not authoritative anymore for Christians, which is like, well, you can't have that both ways. If it's a very interesting thing of how, again, back to this scholar I had mentioned before, he thinks that what I just described is actually symptomatic of us never understanding that whole entire 400, 500 year period in between Malachi and Matthew has given us as Christians sometimes this very distorted picture of the beauty of Jesus's arrival. Like, why were people like Mary, like, she's just ready to sing. She is ready to give a song. And Zechariah, the guy right before her, when John is born, he immediately wants to sing, not just because he was silent for like 9 months, but that finally he's actually experiencing for the first time, probably as a priest, that this God that he has been worshiping actually is truly alive and real.
And he does
and something's
listen.
happening.
Yep. I think too, the silent years for the time, in between the Old Testament and the New is such a misnomer because there were writings and they were thinking about this. We have all of that. It's the pseudepigraphal writings, and you can see like Enoch, where they're processing the Genesis story and thinking about it and adding, other theological considerations and understandings that they have. There's a whole blowout of the angelology and the structure of heaven with archangels and the different things, and they're trying to figure that out, and you just see that they were working it. It's just that depending on which Bible you read, you don't see that. I mean, look at Maccabees, and all of those others, the Baruch and Ezra and all of those. There's a rich tradition that many people are simply blind to.
Well, and even within that material, right? Like, I remember Dr. Heiser used to say that you didn't have one, monolithic Judaism
Right.
that exists during that time. You have Judaisms happening all over the whole entire country, and it's all the more clear where you will read something from Ben Sira, who will essentially, like, outrightly just say the Davidic promise, the Messiah covenant, this idea that there's going to be a coming Messiah or that the Davidic kingdom's important, that's become irrelevant. And yet you then get other books and other writings who are actually saying, no, we are still longing for the Messiah to come, and we are longing for the kingdom of David to be established. And it's just a very interesting thing to realize there were all these different pockets and factions of Judaism.
Right.
And
You're right. There wasn't one, and it wasn't until after the temple was destroyed again in 70 AD, and where the rabbis get together, that is where they came out with the rabbinic Judaism, and that they were much more careful to, have the way we believe. This is what we do as a people. But prior to that, there were many different ways of thinking, and it was okay. Now, and there were disagreements. You even look at the major rabbis, Shammai and Hillel, and the different debates they had, but that was healthy for them. And it caused debate. It was an accepted way, and you do see Jesus interacting with that, where he's, like the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, the Pharisees do, and so he in his debates at the temple and with the different leaders, he's giving them some digs.
And he's pushing back on a
Yes.
lot of the theology that in many ways they had developed because of other vested interests that they had. Right?
Exactly.
I would recommend folks to definitely, like, to me, I'm still mulling over and chewing on this intertestamental period material. But it is fascinating to me that the typical way we sometimes would describe the Sadducees, and I remember in Sunday school we would say, "Oh, the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. That's why they were sad." You see, and
Yeah.
it's so punny, but but that's like how we simplify. Like, well, that's who the Sadducees were, and it's really because we don't have as much material about them because they didn't survive after the temple was destroyed, and the reason why they didn't survive was because their entire existence and their whole power base was cemented upon the assumption that a temple system would be around. And once that was destroyed, their entire reason for existing was gone. Versus the Pharisees.
They were killed in all of the revolts and things like that. They were the wealthy, the rich, the powerful, the chief priests. When the temple's gone, when Jerusalem is destroyed, there's nothing left for them.
Yes. And it's a very interesting thing for me to learn that part of the reason why they emphasized the Torah was because the Torah would give them the scriptural basis for why they existed as priests. That they were making a big deal about the Aaron priesthood, and thus they could fit in that line, and they can do the temple work, and the temple's great, and we can collect our temple taxes and stuff. Versus the Pharisees, they accepted words of the prophets and the Torah, and then the later writings, because in some sense they had also a Davidic hope. They were looking for the Messiah because the prophets talked about it. But also the prophets also had a lot of choice words for the priests in their times, which the Sadducees often were a part of. And the Pharisees, they themselves, they were amongst the people more commonly. They were the typical teachers within the synagogues. And so in some sense, they were able to survive because they stayed closer to the common folk.
Yeah.
And that when the temple was destroyed, the power base, the elites were wiped out. The only real major power or faction that survived through this and was able to carry the Jews through this tumultuous period were the Pharisees that eventually became what we now think of as Rabbinic Judaism.
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, guys. I keep coming out because my sound in my computer just shuts off. I don't know why. It's not done that before. So if I leave again, that's why. So far restarting my computer seems to be making it work again.
Unfortunately, restarting is a pain in the butt.
Yeah. So anyway, that's why I keep disappearing.
Did we want to move on to some of our Christmas songs that we've been thinking about?
Yeah, that would be great. Let's go ahead and do the one that you suggested, Mike. And Angels we have heard on high. This, of course, is now covering you, so we can't see you, but since we can't, you just got to get your wings out, okay? So this one's a French song, and this one was one of my favorites when I was little. I have always loved this one. I think maybe just the melody and the whole
having to learn to say it as eggshell seas.
Right? We don't know what that word is, but it's a cool word. So
Yeah. Just say egg shells.
there you go.
Well, so the reason I chose this song is actually at my church, we're doing a very short sermon series for the season about Christmas carols. And it was not going to be too much about examining the theology. It was just simply, hey, we're going to talk about some of our favorite Christmas carols and then kind of bring in from what these carols a little bit of the theology and then right into the actual scripture of where they're based from. And so this one I chose because I'm doing my passage on Luke 2, and it's going to be from verses 8 to 21. And it's the whole entire narrative that we typically think of about the shepherds out in the fields, and the angels appear and then tell them about Jesus is born. And then they just break out into song. And so what was kind of interesting to me is, like this song for the most part, it's actually pretty on point theologically. But there are a few things that I'm, spoiler alert for folks if they ever do listen to the sermon on Sunday. There are some things, especially at the very beginning, that are just a little like off from the details in Luke 2. Angels we have heard on high, that's fine. But then we get sweetly singing over the plains. They, from what I can tell, they were not sweetly singing. And it's just it's this funny thing. As I was studying the passage, I realized that when in verse 9 it says, and I'm reading from the NIV version, it says in Luke 2 verse 9, an angel of the Lord appeared to them, the shepherds, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. That does not imply to me sweetly singing.
Yeah.
And what was even more funny is that when I looked at the underlying words from the English, the word for suddenly for appearing is actually the Greek word for standing. And it's just implied that the angel wasn't there in one moment. The shepherds are just out there living out in the fields. It's the middle of the night. And then next thing they know, boom, they see a guy standing there right there with them. And so, yeah, just appeared. And it terrified them because all of a sudden now you had the entire sky light up like I want to say Christmas tree, but it probably wasn't a Christmas tree, but it just lit up all of a sudden in the middle of the pitch darkness.
Because the UFO is beaming light down on them. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, it's like nothing, like as the song would say, sweetly singing over the plains. The angel wasn't doing that. He just simply popped up and is like, hello, and there we go.
Well, and my vision of this is that the angel is sitting there hovering in the air on its wings and just flying. And
Angels, the angel host, which means an army of angels.
Yeah, that's the earth thing too.
Only a few angelic beings have wings. I don't know that this group of angels have wings. So thinking of them flying around, oh yeah, I am wearing an angel pin, but with wings. But we got to disabuse our selves that all angels have wings. They don't.
And I would say that there's this very, I mean, it's so hard to break away from kind of like all these like the nativity plays that we've seen in church or on TV and whatever else. But it must have been the scariest thing for these essentially just common folk who are out on the fields. And one of the things about shepherds is like they're not puny people. They're actually, they have to be actually strong enough to carry and like basically lift onto their shoulders full-grown sheep. Especially because sheep are dumb and they will go off to different places and you're just like, what are you doing? Like, I have to literally drag you back over.
And they also have to fight off bears and lions and wolves or coyotes, whatever they had there.
I years ago, I remember one pastor brought up, he asked the simple question to the audience: what do you think of when you hear the word shepherd? And everyone gave him like different answers, but he responded that what he thinks of, the most closest analogous word that he would think of when he hears the word shepherd is warrior. Because just like what you said, Cindy, the shepherds have to be able to lay down their lives for the flock. So they're strong. They have to be good with like slingshots and weaponry to be able to
David?
fight off bears, lions, and other animals that would try to take the sheep from the flock. They also have to be disciplined, because no matter how hungry they are, they cannot eat their sheep. Right? That's the whole point of them being shepherds, is that they will raise enough sheep to the right age that they can sell their wool and also sell them to the market and provide them for the temple. It was their whole entire livelihood. If you ate the sheep, you're eating into the very thing that
Your
will sustain
profits.
you and your family.
Yep.
Exactly. And so like these guys were not, it's weird. We have in the Talmud and in the Midrash written around the 4th and 5th century, the way that the rabbis sometimes thought about shepherds was always this derogatory, like they're dirty, they're smelly, no one wants to be around them, they're thieves and whatever else. And yet nothing from the Old Testament biblical material ever gives us this sense that shepherds were that of bad repute.
Right.
They were not rich.
Shepherds are meant to, they're held up because another word or another image for shepherd is king. That's
Yes.
what the king was supposed to do, is shepherd their people. That's why it's so ironic that David started out as a shepherd and that he was able to kill Goliath with shepherding tools.
Yep.
And
Moses himself became a shepherd for 40 something odd years too.
Yep. All of those are very, very significant, and yeah, like you said, I do think that there were some, in some of the towns, they would have a designated shepherd because each family in a town would have, a couple animals, a couple sheep and maybe a goat or a cow, something to provide milk and cheese. But the sheep were there for the wool, not for the meat, and then the shepherd person would go to each household in the town, gather the various animals, and then watch over them while they grazed outside town. And then in the evening would bring them back and drop them off at their respective homes. And so I don't envision that. I know that this dude was not the ones that were watching over the sheep, but the ones in Bethlehem were definitely, that's 6 miles away from Jerusalem. All of those sheep were destined for the temple.
Yeah. And it's just the fact that they, like the whole entire point of being in that kind of profession, and some of the nice things about it is that you're so disciplined in what you're doing. And since there are not many people out there with you, they're talking to the sheep. And that's why there's even these allusions from Jesus saying that my sheep know my voice, because he's drawing from that whole entire very well-known practice that shepherds were talking to their sheep and even named each of the sheep with a personal name and would talk to them and talk with them to the point that the sheep recognized the voice. So if they were mixed up with other flocks, that shepherd can call out to his sheep and they would all basically just, separate out.
Yep. They'd have a special call to their herd. And
exactly.
And they'd just do their special whistle or whatever, and off they would go. Yep, very true. I heard about, a widow, and I don't know exactly what time it was. It was around the 1st century, where her 2 sheep were taken with all the other, and they wanted to try and return them once the woman explained her situation. And they're like, well, you're not, look at, they're in this pen with 200 other animals. And her son stood up and la 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 la, whatever, did the call, and sure as shooting, all of a sudden the animals started shifting and those 2 animals came to the call of her son. That's just how it's done.
Yeah. So you have these really strong, very physically fit shepherds out there in the fields. terrified of the angels. Absolutely
Yeah.
terrified of them.
Well,
Yeah.
I think too, it's the power that radiates from them. That it's that feeling. I mean, even, Zechariah in the temple, there is something awe inspiring, shocking about encountering one of these beings.
And the fact is not just one being, but that it was a whole host of
It's a
them.
host of them.
And that's kind of like one of those interesting little bits of, as I'm reading through Luke 2, I know who's in the background, right? He's even mentioned at the very first verse in chapter 2, Caesar Augustus. The emperor who brought Pax Romana, the whole entire peace of Rome. And so, like, we have in the background already in our minds as we are listening to the story, if we were in that original audience of Luke's and hearing it, we have in our minds, well, we have our Caesar, we have our Christos, our Son of God, our Savior, our guy who's declared the peace of Rome. We have a cessation of war, technically, but there's no real peace during this era. People in Israel were in rebellion.
That peace was maintained by brutality.
Exactly. And it was the strangest thing when you think about it, is that you have essentially the truest, most powerful army ever appear before shepherds.
Yes.
And who is the leader of them all? A baby that is born in Bethlehem, wrapped in swaddling clothes, laying in a feeding trough. It is the strangest oxymoronic kind of picture that is being presented to the audience here. You have this powerful army that is even more powerful than the army of Rome. And this army is declaring, when everything is in its proper place, when God is exalted in the highest, there is going to be peace on the land, on all those who are allegiant to him. And how do you express your allegiance? Who are you expressing your allegiance to? It is to this little child from a plebeian class family who's been forgotten by time, laying in a feeding trough with other animals. It's like this the most powerful and yet also the most weakest picture, yet they're combined and they are one and the same.
Yep. And their announcement too is peace on earth, goodwill toward men. There's been this rivalry and anger from the angelic realm that man has fallen and has not done according to God's will. But it's like, but the birth of this child, the incarnation of Jesus as God and human, to come and reconcile that, they're declaring, the war is over. We must join together. Peace on earth. We have goodwill toward men. That is an incredibly powerful statement that is being said. And, again, it's not super clear in the Old Testament about, what the angelic realm is thinking about um, humanity, but we do know about God divorcing the nations and how many of those nations, the gods that were assigned, the lesser Elohim that were assigned to them in Psalm 82, as Heiser points out, they're being chastised because they've actually revolted and are not doing the job that they were asked to do. They are no longer leading people back to God the way they had. And so there are indications that there were things going on in the unseen realm that we don't necessarily have visibility to. But here is one of those appearances where the divine realm is wishing, again, peace on earth and goodwill toward men.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that one comes from I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day, which, if everybody's not aware, there's a movie about the making of this song, uh, about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's life. So he wrote this song. It says 1963. That is the wrong date for that song. This was during or just after the Civil War, something like that, where his son, he had lost his second wife. Her dress caught fire, of all things, which is probably not that uncommon at the time because they had some really big dresses and they had a lot of candles. So she died because her dress caught fire. His son got injured in the Civil War after he didn't want him to go at all. And so he struggled for a long time. And so this movie is about how Longfellow struggled and ended up finding faith even throughout all of his struggles. So that's a pretty neat one. I don't think there's too much. This one's very contextual to the day if you know that this was written in the 1800s during the time of the Civil War, because there was a lot of
The cannon thundered in the south.
a lot of less, not so much peace on earth, and yet he's still writing and singing about it. Okay, so yeah, there's quite a few other songs we could talk about, but actually let's talk about Hark the Herald Angels Sing, because this one has really cool theology, I think. I'm going to go ahead and read it because then we'll get it all in our heads. I feel like singing it, but I won't do that. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled. Joyful all ye nations rise, join the triumph of the skies. With angelic hosts proclaim, Christ is born in Bethlehem. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Christ by highest heaven adored, Christ the everlasting Lord. Late in time, behold him come, offspring of a virgin's womb. Veiled in flesh the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity. Pleased with us in flesh to dwell, Jesus our Emmanuel. Hail the heavenly Prince of Peace, hail the Son of Righteousness. Light and life to all he brings, risen with healing in his wings. Mild he lays his glory by, born that man no more may die, born to raise the sons of earth, born to give them second birth. Come, desire of nations, come, fix in us thy humble home. Rise the woman's conquering seed, bruise in us the serpent's head. Now display thy saving power, ruined nature now restore. Now in mystic union join, thine to ours and ours to thine. Adam's likeness, Lord, efface, stamp thine image in its place. Second Adam from above, reinstate us in thy love. Let us thee, thou lost, regain, thee, the life, the inner man. O to all thyself impart, formed in each believing heart. That one is awesome. And when I was little, being raised in the LDS church, I didn't sing all of these verses.
I'm not familiar with the last two.
Yeah,
Yeah.
me neither. I didn't realize the last two even existed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure which hymnal this came from, but that's the case with a lot of songs, a lot of hymns, because we'll only sing these verses in church, and then you don't sing all of them, and so you don't even know that they exist. But yeah, I was going to get out my LDS hymnal, but I couldn't find it. It's buried in boxes somewhere. The version that's in that book is definitely different because they don't believe that Jesus is the incarnation in the way that we do, and so the whole verse about being incarnate and all of that, it's
Veiled in flesh the Godhead see.
yeah, yeah. And I feel like I've probably sang that when I was younger, but the meaning was different, So, yeah. But this one is just so much deep theology here.
It is a good one.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting. What it does remind me is years ago I used to watch the Charlie Brown Christmas specials all the time as a little kid. I had no idea what they were talking about. I wasn't a Christian
Right?
or whatever else. It was just
Uh-huh.
like cartoons. I'm watching a cartoon, and it was only like when I was like after I graduated from college, I was already a Christian, and then like the original Charlie Brown Christmas special with like the tree that like the little dangling Christmas tree that was really
The
sad.
Charlie Brown Christmas tree. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was a moment in middle of the cartoon where Charlie Brown makes this allusion to like, oh yeah, it's like that whole entire thing with the writing on the wall with Nebuchadnezzar. I'm like,
Wait, what?
excuse me?
Just the cartoon?
And I realized like it was done in the 1950s. The cartoon was made during that time, and it is just kind of shows that there was kind of this unofficial Christian, if you would say Christianese, that even existed, even with people who were not necessarily very devout churchgoers, but in general public, they were familiar with the language of scripture, that they could even use it in normal, just like colloquial language and just
There were
talking.
prayers in before school. I mean, it was allowed to pray in school. It was, and I do think that people were, biblically literate more so. They read more than we do.
Yeah. And so it was a very interesting thing just to see that, Hark the Herald Angels Sing is like, oh my gosh, like that, for you to understand what the heck you are singing, you would have to really actually know a lot of Bible. You would have to actually know a lot of theology to understand what these words are. And the fact that verses 4 and 5 mention about the serpent's head being bruised, bruising in us, the second Adam, like, and even
The
like a
conference.
little bit of
Yeah.
Athanasius here going on of like, hey, we're gonna have the image of God being stamped back on top of us. That whole entire thing of the image being recreated in us because of Jesus. Like, holy cow. It's in there.
Second Adam from above. Look at that. Yeah, all of that.
Yeah, this one's a cool one. So
Mm.
everybody should be singing this one this week. Yeah, that one's great. Okay, one more really good one, just because I think this is interesting. God rest ye merry gentlemen. Like, we tend to think that this song is God rest ye, and then the comma goes there, and then it's talking to merry gentlemen. But actually, God rest ye merry was like a whole phrase in and of itself. So it's addressing the gentlemen, and it's telling them to rest in merriness, like, and rest there being like the idea of comfort and repose and security because God has your back,
So is ye like an old English way of saying in?
Right. Yeah. So this is pretty old hymn from about the middle of the 1600s. And so I don't know, some new versions will put you instead of ye because we don't understand ye today in our modern English. We don't use that. But I think that's like a plural form of you.
Right.
Yeah.
Just like, oh, ye of little faith, It's
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
This one's pretty neat how it's got the theme of being rescued from Satan's power. So a lot of the hymns are about our sinfulness and, all of that kind of thing. But this one directly says Satan's power. So you ought to be thinking about, what does that mean? What is Satan's power? It's probably referencing just death in general and all of the things that go along with that. And, probably quite a bit of theology packed in just that statement if you want to think about it.
Yep. Although that's interesting. I'm looking at the verse 4. The shepherds at those tidings rejoiced much in mind and left their flocks a feeding in tempest, storm, and wind. It's probably supposed to be in tempest, storm, and wind, because mind and wind. But they're not tempest or storm there.
Yeah.
But But
interesting.
it was a nice attempt at rhyming for the second line.
Right.
You know, some of these songs, they got to put some words in there to make the meter work.
Yeah, well, that's obviously not from biblical imagery as far as the scene in Luke 2, but it's very interesting just the idea that the shepherds could leave their flocks and in the storm in order to go to worship the Lord of the storm, basically. Maybe that's what it's trying to get to. Maybe that. Maybe
Maybe
I'm just giving it too much credence. I don't know.
or maybe they were like thinking when the glory of God was shining around them that itself was like a storm. Maybe they were thinking it's like related to lightning. I'm not sure.
Ah, that could be the glory of God and lightning.
I mean, it is interesting that this is a much older carol. I mean, if the date 1650 is correct, that they're willing to talk about the power of Satan, and that even within just how it's described, if ye is the plural you, then essentially that they're also thinking very communally for the community. It's not an individual, like you are individually saved, but that all of us
Yeah.
are actually benefiting from this work that Jesus had done.
Like Tim Mackey says, y'all.
Yeah, that's kind of
Right.
weird to realize that
Yeah.
ye is the original y'all.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of good theology. A lot of songs just kind of insert detail, and you're like, wow, where'd that come from? I don't know.
Yeah, like the song I Saw Three Ships Come Sailing In. I'm like, okay, well, Bethlehem is landlocked. And
Where are the ships
why are
coming
Mary
from?
and Joseph and baby Jesus on a ship? I, you know,
I thought they were going to be about the Magi.
no, although there is a legend about it that the song, because the relics of the Magi were supposedly discovered in Byzantium and transported somewhere in Italy, and eventually were transported to the cathedral in Cologne, Germany. And this song may have been from the Magi, their trip on a ship to Cologne. But that's
Oh,
speculation. You know, I don't
huh.
know. But it's you know, it's I saw three ships come sailing in, you know, on Christmas Day. Yeah, nope, it's not. It's not. And then it's like, and who is on the ship? It's Mary and Joseph and the baby. So it can't even be the Magi because it's talking about who's on the ship.
Huh.
So
Yeah.
very
Well, I don't
creative
know about that
theology there.
one. Yeah.
It's a nice tune.
Yeah, it's really actually you can find quite a bit of information on at least speculation on some of these songs.
Yeah.
Sometimes they know where they come from. Other times they really don't because people just were singing them and they weren't recorded, they weren't written down in a hymnal or something until later, and in which case you really don't know. So,
Right. Or like
Well,
the Coventry Carol, some of the English things that definitely the origins are a little bit unknown.
I think it's also it is interesting, right? Like it's easy to kind of to bag on the carols of like I was doing earlier. It's like it wasn't sweetly, softly singing over the plain,
Yeah.
but at the same time, right? To give some grace as well to the original writers and the audience. How many of them had ever traveled to Israel? How many of them actually know what the topography is even like? And so they're using what they know. And it's often what happens, right? Whenever we read the scriptures,
right.
if we
Yeah.
don't understand a certain cultural aspect, we immediately take our own cultural context and we fill in that gap. And sometimes we can get away with it without any real bad theology coming out of it. And sometimes we come up with really weird theologies because of that. And that's almost like what happened with the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park when they inserted, frog DNA into there.
Yeah. Yeah.
They all got webbed feet. No.
they did some interesting things.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Speaking of things with interesting theology and we don't understand where it really comes from, we have the song "O Holy Night," which it was written in French and then it was translated in English. And the translation is of the first translation really is so very different from the original song. Like it's almost unrecognizable. So here's the first translation that this is what we're used to. And this was actually translated by a Unitarian. So that's interesting in and of itself.
Oh.
And it was supposedly written by an atheist, actually. A pastor had asked this atheist to write the song. So he wrote the song, and I'll show the retranslation of the original here in a second. And then when they wanted to translate it into English, this Unitarian, and a Unitarian is not a Trinitarian, so he didn't believe in the Trinity. And that's quite interesting just in and of itself. And this one, there's also other interesting things about this song. It's kind of a strange, I don't know, like you have some things in history that they just have weird things involving them, like this weird translation. It was written by an atheist, translated by a Unitarian, and "O Holy Night" was the first song that was broadcast over radio in 1906, I think it was. This was the first song that they broadcast to multiple people. So that's interesting. And you'll also hear stories about either the Franco-Prussian War or World War I, depends on the story. This was a song that the French were supposedly singing in the trenches, and all of the fighting stopped, and that kind of a story. It probably didn't happen, but so it's so weird how this song has such a strange history. And as far as the theology, it's got a focus on sin being the problem that Christ came to solve, instead of, a broader idea of something that we should probably be thinking of more than just our personal sin. But yeah.
It is kind of ironic and interesting to me about how if this song was ever, if it was created more in our recent times, and especially within evangelicalism, there's always like these questions that come like, oh, should we stop singing this song from this music artist because they had a moral failing? Or should we stop singing these worship songs from this Christian
Right.
group because they're part of a prosperity gospel group or whatever else, or like whatever accusation. And yet I have never heard anyone ever bring up, we really shouldn't be singing "O Holy Night."
Right? Yeah. Even though it was technically written by somebody who wasn't Christian, and it was translated, our version was translated by somebody who didn't believe in the Trinity.
Well, not even just like not even being a Christian, but like as an atheist, like just actively not believe there's any sort of even like
Right.
not even like a theistic belief, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's even more ironic.
The original words now.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the retranslation of the original words. "Midnight, Christians, is the solemn hour when God as man descended unto us to erase the stain of original sin and to end the wrath of his Father."
Ooh.
Yeah, so here we go. We got a lot of original sin and wrath stuff going on here, which we could talk about that. But yeah, and it sounds very Christian, right? Maybe a little too Christian. Like if you were an atheist writing a Christmas song or writing a song about Christianity at all, it might sound a bit hard hitting like this. On this night that
He definitely, this person knows, maybe he was raised in the faith, but fell away because
he's
there's so
writing
much
it.
he knows. Yeah.
he's writing it on bequest on behalf of this pastor who asked him to write it. So he's probably going to cater to what the pastor's going to want. Otherwise, the pastor's not going to use the song. Nobody's going to hear it. So, yeah, it's quite interesting. But I kind of like the words as it goes on anyway. The entire world thrills with hope on this night that gives it a savior. People kneel down, await your deliverance. So we've got some good deliverance language going on there. And yeah. Let's see. It's talking about the star and the Oriental kings.
Lovely.
The King of Kings, yeah. But you see, it's very different from this original. It's like the original had that really strong emphasis on sin and wrath. And then our typical English translation still has that, but it's a little bit tempered, I feel like.
It's more, about the weary world and under the burden of sin and error. I don't know.
It's kind of strange. I wonder how it went from the original into something that, like, this may not be a popular opinion, but I'm not a big fan of a lot of the Christmas carols, and "Oh Holy Night" is actually one of the songs that usually like bore me to tears whenever I hear it sung, because the way it's done is so solemn and slow and very. I get it. You're supposed to be very, contemplative as you're listening and singing the song.
It's meant for the soprano to just soar. No,
which like unfortunately my vocal range isn't there, so like I can't really participate.
Yeah.
But it's just really interesting that what Carey had brought up, and it just showed like how in the world do you go from this, which is always kind of like, which is already kind of strange, and then you get to this that now has morphed into what I typically think of whenever I hear it played in church or in other places. Yeah, it's just like, it's such a weird. I wonder what happened in mid-translation.
Yeah. Well, probably somebody looked at that and went, "Oof, this needs fixing."
Probably.
Yeah.
It is interesting. Like, I do wonder, like, maybe you're right, Cindy, that the guy grew up in some sort of religious background, or he decided to just attend like a big tent revival just to do some research and see what do Christians talk like.
Yeah. It's hard to say, but he got the gist of it. That's right.
It's like really on the nose too, of like original sin. It's like, gotta make sure, and not just sin, gonna say it's original. Really gonna make sure I sell this to the pastor.
Right, and well, that's what I mean about it being so hard hitting. Like, I'm gonna make sure that everyone knows what I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Let's see. What else do we have? Well, we could talk about Joy to the World. This one's interesting.
Oh.
Like, I've always thought this was just a Christmas song, but it's actually a very eschatological song.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, not that can't also be a Christmas song, because if you're talking about the incarnation, you can also be talking about the fulfillment of everything.
Yeah.
Well, it is talking about the coming of Jesus. Just the question is, I think most people assume it's talking about the first coming.
Yeah.
But it's really his second coming.
Yep. Yeah. Especially the fourth verse, because he rules the world with truth and grace.
Yeah.
It's like it's talking about he's currently ruling. When Jesus was born, he wasn't ruling in an active sense. It's the already and not yet moment. Like, you see the king is here.
Well, I almost see the crucifixion as his coronation.
Yes, there is there's that
Right.
aspect as well.
Right.
And then the ascension is when he goes to sit on his throne. So,
Hmm.
but yeah, no more let sin and sorrows grow, nor thorns infest the ground. Well, that hasn't happened in my backyard. I'm digging out
Right.
Hmm.
weeds and thistles like unbelievable. So I find it interesting, the in the repeat there on in verse 3, far as the curse is found, he's
Yes.
making his blessings flow as far as wherever that curse is found, in all those little tiny cracks and crevices, his blessings will flow in there.
Yeah.
Makes me think of the river in Ezekiel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Changing the Dead Sea into a fresh water.
Mm.
Okay, so do you want to hear? Should we talk about one of the worst Christmas songs?
Uh-oh.
Cindy, yeah, Cindy wanted to talk about this one, "Away in a
Oh
Manger."
my, and it's Martin Luther?
Yeah.
Well, it's
Attributed.
attributed to Martin Luther. I don't think it actually was.
Okay, so this is
It's
a smear campaign.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I think it did show up in an evangelical Lutheran hymnal. And they were
Interesting.
like, we want this to be attributed to Luther so that
I should
everybody
look and
really loves our song.
let me
So,
look at. I've got a hymnal here, and I had
oh,
flagged that one. It says text is American and American 9th century. It does not attribute it to Lutheran, and this is a Lutheran hymnal,
okay.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, we don't have
1885.
any old German versions of it. There are German versions, but I think it probably was originally English, which that wouldn't have been written by Luther then,
Yeah,
because he spoke German. So,
very much
yeah.
so. But
Yeah.
yeah, I would. This song is very sweet, and I don't want anybody to stop liking it. It's sweet, and the tune is nice.
Right, right. I
Hmm.
But it's
love the
like,
tune of this. It's a fun
but
song to sing.
okay, so um, away in a manger. Where do I start here? Dr. Kenneth Bailey, and his Jesus in Middle Eastern Eyes totally changes this whole story about the birth of Jesus, because there were no inns in Bethlehem. Inns were Roman buildings to house travelers on busy thoroughfare, where there's going to be a lot of traffic. Bethlehem was a little hole in the wall. There wasn't even an inn in Bethlehem. So, and the there was no room in the quote inn was there's no room in the ketaluma. And what that Greek word means, ketaluma, means upper room. It's the same word that's used for where the Jesus and the disciples celebrated the Last Supper.
Hmm.
So they weren't in an inn for the Last Supper, they were in a guest room. It's the upper room reserved for guests. Well, there was no room in the guest room. And so they were invited to come into the home, and they were in with the family on the main floor. And that is where Mary gave birth to her baby. Then you also have to understand that Israelite homes um, would have had a small area, kind of like I talked about earlier, where you had a couple sheep and a goat or a cow, maybe if for food and for wool. And so they had a small place, usually with the floor slightly lower, so that the animals would be there. And you can even see in back in the Old Testament where, oh shoot, what was his name? Jephthah. He was one of the judges in Numbers. And he promises that if God has him successful in his battle, that he will offer the first thing that comes out of his house as a sacrifice to the Lord. Well, that's because he's expecting a sheep to come out the door. But it's his daughter, and that's another story. But anyway, so you can see that even, way back, people would have their animals, and it was for safety, especially when you were living in a little town and you didn't have a huge flock. You needed to keep them in a pen or close to you. But then you also see, yes, Joshua, most icons portray it in a cave. I'm getting there, don't believe me. Oh, I'm getting there. And I'm sorry, this was my whole rant. And I told Carey that I was kind of going to rant about this. But so, anyways, these houses would have a little feeding trough there. So, how convenient for Mary, who just gave birth to her baby. And in the Orthodox icons, you will see that there are midwives there washing the baby. It wasn't just Mary and Joseph. um she had people there to help her with this birthing process. But then what they would do is, there weren't cribs back in the day. Nobody had a crib. Everybody just slept on a pallet on the floor. So with the birth of Jesus and putting a baby in a safe place, the manger would have been a safe place out of the way from all the people, and yet it also was crib-like for him to be laid there. So that's like the first verse of Away in a Manger. The stars in the heavens looked down where he lay. Well, they could have looked down on the house, but again, he's in the house. He's on the lower level with a guest room above him. Yes, he's sleeping on the hay. So now here we've got the cattle are lowing, and yep, they are. The baby awakes, but little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes. Well, Jesus wasn't the most perfect baby. He would have cried just like anybody else. He would have pooped his pants just like everybody else. He would have gotten hungry. The only thing is, he was sinless as concerning the Mosaic law. That is, and his devotion and focus on God. But he was human, and he would have done human things. So let's not make him, he sleeps the night through. He has since he was born. I don't think so. I think he was like a normal.
Well, and the whole idea of babies crying and how that is sinful, that's not no, let's not go there, because like, babies have needs. They have to let you know what those needs are. The reason and the way that they're going to do that is by crying. There's nothing sinful about a baby crying.
Yeah, and it's not selfish either. I mean, a baby has needs, and they don't have the mental capacity to think of others at that point yet. I mean, their world is not big enough, and their brain isn't developed.
And if the whole idea of crying is a sinful thing, well, we are supposed to cry to God. We're supposed to lament. We're supposed to bring our complaints to God. That's not a sinful thing to do.
I think a lot of that, it does portray a little bit of, it's unspoken, but I think at times we as Christians, we do have this attitude that to actually be human, in the sense of showing vulnerability, showing our pain, showing just even a child that's crying, like those things remind us of weakness, of not self-sufficiency, of a lack of autonomy. And so those things must be bad, and so thus they must be sinful. And it's just weird of how our theology at times like goes to such an extreme to deny something that's actually a very natural process.
Or even, growing up, children are to be seen and not heard. Well, Jesus wanted the little children to come to him, and he would often use lessons that said, look at these, you have to be childlike in order to really inherit the kingdom. And I want you to be like these and receive and be open. So there are lessons that we can learn from children.
It is interesting because about that whole thing about the child not crying. Years ago, I was an engineering major in college, but we had to take a couple of like non-engineering classes to meet our requirements, and so I decided to take a course on European history. And it was interesting to learn that during the time of all the multiple plagues that had hit Europe, there was
Oh,
actually this concept that developed where they refused to actually name their newborns until they got to around the age of 5 or 6. That the child, boy or girl, would be running around the house and there would be no name for the child yet. And the reasoning was because if they had gotten sick by the Black Plague, typically the children would not survive. And to save themselves the grief that would happen if they actually had named the child, it was a better solution to not name the child and to not even have that parental attachment to the child until after 5 or 6, because by that point they are assuming the son or the daughter is now strong enough. If they did get sick, they would survive. And so let's now give the child a name. We'll now start acting like the mom and dad towards the kid. It was just this very interesting kind of perspective of we cannot have an attachment to this person. And so that affected in many ways this perception of children for a long, long time. And so I wonder if some of that is also kind of kicking in of like, this, it's a sinful thing to hear a baby crying, because in some sense I have no real attachment to this child right now because I can't risk it emotionally.
Yeah.
So it's interesting of just like even just the time frame of like, was that affecting why these lyrics were written the way they were?
yeah. So I do want to go back. Joshua Davidson in the comments had mentioned something about the Orthodox, the icon of the nativity shows Mary and Jesus in a cave. So some of my evangelical background in yes, and it is like a tomb. In fact, the swaddling cloths look like funeral bindings on the baby Jesus, and the manger where he is laid can often look either like an altar, a sacrificial altar, or the slab of a tomb. So it's really theologically connecting the whole incarnation, and the purpose of the incarnation is because Jesus needs to die in order to accomplish his mission and defeat death and raise all of us in the future to eternal life. And so I understand the theology, but I've had a hard time with my being so impacted by Ken Bailey's book. But I do know that there were Israelite homes that were built around caves or in caves, and so it is very possible that this house was the lower level of this house could have been a cave, or part of it could have been a cave. So I don't know. I'm fine with the Orthodox stories about Jesus being born in a cave. I'm also fine with stories about Jesus being born in a home.
Well, I think that the language of the inn also harkens back to the Last Supper. So you've got the connection with the birth and the
Right.
death.
Exactly. The whole incarnation and all of that. Yep.
And even though it is iconography, I mean, to me, like iconography has its origins in art,
Yes.
and art itself is meant to be an interpretation, a way to very condensedly summarize like this kind of theology that we know into like in a still static image. So you're supposed to see so much that's happening right in that image, right? Like I'm thinking of like Rembrandt, who painted himself into the crucifixion depictions of Jesus. He wasn't there physically. We know that he can't time travel, but he's expressing this theological point that it was my sins that had placed him upon that cross too, even though separated by 1,500 years.
Yep.
But like in the art, he's conveying a theological concept. I guess I'm providing some grace towards whoever originally came up with that iconography, but that is actually a very cool way of depicting of like this foreshadowing
Yes.
Mhm.
And all those little elements are there, and you can even see oftentimes Joseph is off in another cave or another section, and he's either, just looking very pensive, or sometimes there's this little man, and that's supposed to be the devil that is, causing Joseph to question whether this is really happening. But you see the shepherds, and you see the magi, and you see all of these different things, because all of those events are in the biblical story, and just how they get represented. But it's just chock full of theology and biblical messages. There's usually two animals also near that manger. One is a donkey, and one is either a bull, or and sometimes there might be sheep there too, but it's like a clean animal and an unclean animal. And the bull would have been, a sacrificial animal and things like that. So there's like, yeah, so much detail. And there's great information on YouTube about the nativity icon.
Yeah. Well, and the whole point of icons is, well, okay, not the whole point, but part of the point would be for people who they don't have scripture right in front of them. They can't just go home and pick up their Bible and do devotions. So
Most of
they're
them can't
doing the,
read.
yeah, and they can't read even if they did. So they're trying to do devotions in a different way, and they can do it in front of an image, and the image is going to lead their thought process, and as they think about the the whole situation with Jesus' incarnation, his life, his death, his resurrection, his the harrowing of hell, the ascension, all of that wrapped up in all of those imageries.
Well, and I think too, even if you do read and things like that, the icon is a visual representation, so that you're interacting with another one of your senses. It's not just, and it's triggering a different part of your brain to be thinking about this. So it's really
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. So like the point of an icon isn't okay. We're going to portray it completely historically as if we just took a picture and now we're going to paint that. I mean, and not again, not to downplay the idea of the cave, but it's again really not the point of what's going on in an icon.
Yep. Okay, now going back to the lyrics of this song, I just want to go to the bottom. Um, the last line of verse 3. N.T. Wright has really been on a
Yeah.
campaign. Fit us for heaven to live with thee there. We There's going to be a new heavens and a new earth. We are going to be physically resurrected, and we are going to live with God in a united heaven and earth. This is deist here, of where it's escapism, where we're going to go and live up in heaven after we die. And I'm not saying that we aren't in God's presence immediately upon death, but it's not our end state. How does N.T. Wright say it? It's the stage of life after death, life after death. Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
Some
um,
some theologians call it the intermediate state.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
but I
yeah. I
just,
mean,
it just makes the way this is phrased, and this is not the only hymn, and you can put the lyrics down, but it's really, uh, we're not going to escape it. We're not going to go off and sit on clouds and have angel wings and eat all the cream cheese we want, because it's not fattening anymore. I mean,
I'm like thinking of the commercial that had that imagery.
yeah. Philadelphia cream cheese. Yeah.
That's what it is.
yeah. I mean, you could spin that last term in that last line into something that's more, better theologically, but you really do know that that's what it's coming out from, like this idea that we're just waiting to die and get to heaven, and in nowhere the Bible is not describing that kind of reality. It's just not. We are going to go and be with the Lord, but this whole idea that I just have to wait until I die and then everything will be okay because I'll be in heaven. Like that's discounting our lives here on earth. It's not putting forth the idea that what you do here matters and that the point of life is to be an imager of God and to be his representative and to be on that kind of a mission, and that's really what our focus should be, and not just, well, when I die everything's going to be fine. Like,
Well, or
okay,
even
but
how do we treat the earth now? It's all going to be burned up anyway, so it doesn't matter. And I'm like, I think it matters. I mean, not that God can't repair whatever
right,
has been broken, but uh, if we really are in alignment with biblical theology, we need to be good stewards now. We need to image God and do what he has asked us to do from day one.
I think that it's just one of those moments where you have tension within certain theological, or like you have all this like theological truth that's there in the scripture, and they're all supposed to actually create this tension with each other. But people often don't like the tension. They
they
don't
don't want
like
that.
that you have one concept pulling this way, another concept, and they're both true. And so they would rather just see one win out and then de-emphasize the other, or never mention the others as well, the other concepts, the other verses, the other like support and evidence that would balance my favorite concept. And so for some folks, there's this idea of like there's a heaven. I want to have the assurance that when I die, because dying is very scary. I've seen dying happen, and it's not a pleasurable experience. I want to believe and know that there's something that's coming for me that's better than this. Right? I've seen family members die. I've seen all these other things, terrible events happen. I want to believe that there's something after I close my eyes and I'm gone from this life. Right? And so where do we go after we die? And it's like, well, hopefully we'll be in heaven. And that is like the immediate need to soothe for people who are longing for some sort of comfort. Where's my relative? Where's my mom? Where's my sister?
Yeah.
And so that becomes the driving force behind, unfortunately, for those of us who are in pastoral ministry. We're trying to comfort people, and we just want to give them some sense of peace immediately. But then
They're in a better place now.
Exactly, right? And then we forget that really the reason we can even say they're in a better place is because they are waiting for the better reality that's coming, resurrection.
Yep.
A few months ago, one of the families in our church, the wife in the family, she lost her brother to a terrible train accident. We'll go into the details, but it was pretty brutal. And the family, they're Nigerian American, Haitian American, I should say, actually. And what they did, surprisingly, was they asked my pastor. They've been at our church for so many years, but they asked our pastor, will you do the funeral service? And so, like, our church, which is multi-ethnic, has a lot of different ethnicities coming every Sunday. But, like, me and my wife show up for the service, and it's like all of a sudden we just instantly became an African-American church. And the parking lot was overflowing. There was, like, so many people that knew this guy. And pastor after pastor, minister after minister was going up there, giving their thoughts and their eulogies. And they were saying, he's in a better place. He's in a better place. He's in heaven. He's in a better place. When he died, he's in a better place, and we'll see him again one day. There's this desire to bring comfort. And I was so proud of my pastor that when it was time for him to finally give his homily, he pointed very clearly out. It's like, you know what? Heaven is actually very imaginable. We all have an image or idea about what heaven's like. But what is unimaginable, what is hard for us to grasp our minds around, resurrection. And that's actually what the greater hope is. Heaven is nice, sure. But heaven and earth in resurrected bodies, that's unimaginable for us. We can't even conceptualize it. But that's the reality, and that's what the scriptures are pointing to. And it was just, I was so proud of him.
Oh, that is so beautiful. Thank you
Of
for
just
sharing that.
going right at it, of like, look, everyone, I'm not saying, he was very kind in the sense of like, yeah, I get it, right? We had 400 people over, like just overflowing, and they were still coming in. It was like 2 hours into the service,
Oh,
and
wow.
people were still flowing in because of just how tragic this death was. And so everyone is looking for like, why? And where is he? And will we see him again? And yes, all those things are true, but let's not get distracted by the intermediate state. As one pastor that I used to listen to as well, he called it, it's essentially like the airport lounge. It's like we're making a big deal about the airport club, the lounge that's in the airports. Like, yeah, that's nice. You can stay in there and get a cocktail or something. But
That's interesting because N.T. Wright has kind of talked about it too. My father's house has many mansions, and he's like, those are the word and the terminology is really just a layover place. It's not
yeah,
meant to be a permanent residence. So yeah.
yeah, it was a for me a very proud moment of just like listening to my pastor, just like, because he got this pressure of like, there were like 3-4 pastors right before him, all from the churches that this family came from, and their families were still going to, and they're talking about like, oh, he's in heaven and we're going to see him again one day. And my pastor comes up and says, heaven and earth are coming back, like they're coming back together, and resurrection is the final hope. Like, that is the real hope. It's not that we're going to see an ethereal spirit. We're going to have our actual physical bodies again, perfected, glorified. It's going to be what it was meant to be. And, like for myself this past year, I lost my sister in February to cancer. And to me, that resurrection has meant a whole lot more to me this year than it had years past. It was still a big deal to me. I still believe the same things about heaven and earth coming together. I believe resurrection was the biggest deal. But after she passed away in February, resurrection became even more potent for me, because I had watched essentially 5-6 years of the cancer that took her ultimately in the end eat her away. And resurrection is the promise that what I had saw being stolen from my sister would not just only be paid back, but even overflowed to beyond what was originally there. Like, to me, that as Christians, we have a message that is so much stronger than the typical kind of religious ideas about we're going to float up in heaven and have harps. We're talking about that our actual physical body is who we are, the people that we become. All these things matter, and they will be remembered. And not just remembered, they will be restored and perfected. And that is a crazy message to say, but that is actually the Christian message of the resurrection.
Well, and it's also the purpose for the incarnation.
Yeah.
It was the incarnation was necessary in order for the resurrection to occur, which is God's final purpose, and his will be done. We just don't know what time.
Yeah. So even bad hymns and bad songs can help us get into good theology.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and again, it's not like this is like the worst song ever or anything like that, but
I will still sing it.
I'm gonna keep singing it. I'm not gonna stop singing it. I love the song, but just stopping to think about what you're singing, why you're singing it, and even when it's not got the best theology, or you realize that details are not actually present historically or whatever else, you can still think about like the better ideas, or the idea of why somebody had those ideas, because a lot of times it's not that they didn't know that they had bad theology when they were writing the song. They were just doing what they they thought was best, so yeah.
It was their tradition. It was their environment that they were raised in. We're all products of our culture. And a lot of times we don't even realize it, and it is I think, the three of us and people like us, where we've really made an effort to work to understand a different worldview, a different culture than what our current culture is. And I just think, thank you. I'm glad I'm not alone.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's kind of partly the point of, you know, when you go off on your own and you try and come up with your own ideas, that's when you really are getting into trouble. But when you start coming together and talking about things, you start getting the better theology, better ideas, realizing where people used to be, where we are now, and, hopefully in the future we can even be some level of understanding above, and, so.
Yep.
Yeah, we didn't get to this song that is so
Ah!
much.
Oh dear. I thought you were gonna get to like Mariah Carey's.
No, this one was requested by Paul, and I'm sorry, Paul, but there's not a whole lot we can even talk about because Saint Nick in this song, he's not punching anybody. We don't have Arius in here. We don't.
Yeah,
So, I don't know.
yeah, it's not any ecumenical council going on.
No, yeah. Well, it's funny that Paul mentioned this in chat because my dad, he loved the Beach Boys so very much and that kind of music. And so I grew up listening to this a lot. I like the song. It's just not very theologically rich.
I did like that there's a line about Rudy, or I'm assuming that's Rudolph is leading.
Mhm.
I think like a few days ago, we're driving to get some grocery shopping done, and we passed by this this little float that was like outside of the shop, and it had Santa on a little biplane, like basically like aviator goggles and like the scarf and everything, but it's like all like Christmas colors. And I joked with my wife that it's like, I guess Rudolph and the rest of the reindeer had retired.
They're riding inside the thing.
It's like, it's been about 50 years. Rudolph's nose cannot be that bright anymore.
We're tired now. Give us a break, okay?
They're down in Florida, kicking up their hooves.
I gotta have retirement sometime.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you guys for coming on and talking about all of this with me. It's been a fun discussion.
Yeah,
Very,
thank you.
very nice. Thank you. And have a Merry Christmas, Mike, Carey.
Yeah, oh, you too.
Merry Christmas to you too.
I hope your sermon goes well, Mike. And
Yes.
yeah.
I hope so. I have an idea what I want to say. It's just how I say it is going to be interesting because, Christmas Eve services, I've now discovered, at least in my area, the big service is actually the week before. Because a lot of people will be traveling during the Christmas time.
I see, yeah.
And so the people who are still around are going to be true locals like me, and people who were locals but then didn't like the code and just left, and now they're coming back to visit family again. And so it's going to be interesting. Of like I'm going to see what it's like on a Christmas Eve, who's actually around, and it'll be interesting to see how this kind of sermon would actually go and how it would fly with people who may be checking out the church for the first time.
Yeah. Is it going to be recorded so people can listen to it online?
It will be recorded. It will probably be like a few weeks every so often. It'll get uploaded and everything like that. So we'll see. It will be recorded. I have a terrible habit of actually needing to hear how did my sermon sound to myself, and I don't like my own voice. But I do it because it's also the only way I can get better.
It's true. Yes. I definitely feel you there.
Well, good luck. And yeah, I'd like to hear it whenever it's available.
Yeah, like
I,
if you get me a link, we can probably put it in the show notes for people too, so they can get even more Christmas song stuff.
I will try. But yeah, it'll be interesting. I think that's the reason why I brought up that whole the Christmas Carol, and
That was good.
a little hint, if anything, about the message. I've realized the main character in Luke verses 8 to 21 are not the shepherds, because if you depends on what you define as main characters, right? Because the shepherds talked a lot about, but they don't do much. The verbs that are associated with them are all either passive or participles. They're not active. They're not active players until the very end of those verses.
They're
And it's
witnesses and
yeah,
observers.
yeah. They're having things done to them, said to them, things about them, but they don't actively do something until after the announcement. So
Well,
what
and
they
then they
do is in
go
response.
say, yeah,
Yes.
let's go see
Yes.
this. They were given a sign, and so now they're going to go and check it out.
Yeah. And even then you could even argue the let's go see is not really active. It's like it's a suggestion. Hey guys, do you want to do this? and it could be yes or no. Obviously they do. But it's a very interesting thing to realize. And I had to kind of break out of it in my mind of like the shepherds are the main characters, the shepherds are the main characters. And it's like, wait a minute, but if main characters usually are doing something, they usually have some agency. They usually are doing something. And being terrified is not agency.
Yeah, it doesn't really qualify you as the lead in a story.
Yeah, and so and it's not the sheep. The sheep are not the main characters, and so yeah, and so I think it's gonna be an interesting. I'm curious to see how people will respond to realize that maybe sometimes we do make the Christmas narratives a little bit too much about us,
Yeah.
and looking at it from just a purely human perspective, and we can't blame ourselves for that. We are human, but to catch ourselves doing that is weird. It was a weird moment from yesterday.
It is
Yeah.
good because, I mean, God is really acting. I mean, you've got Gabriel appearing, as this messenger. I mean, we've seen him once, maybe twice in the Old Testament, and now he's all over.
Well, and it's even that angel that appears, the word that it uses to describe him as proclaiming the good news, or I bring good news to you. It culturally, that word in Greek implied, if it's being used, that the carrier, the herald of that message, personally has a vested interest in the message. That there was it was good news for the carrier too. It wasn't just like, hey, I was told to announce this to you because it's my job. It's
Not
I
just a
personally
news
actually
boy.
find joy in this message. Like this is a good thing to me too. And so it was a very interesting thing to realize, like, this angel actually liked his job. He actually really enjoyed the message. This message is a good thing for him. And even though the people are completely terrified and screaming at the top of their lungs at the moment he appeared, he still found enjoyment in, like, hey, your great fear, I'm going to exchange that for great joy because I have great news that I personally like. And so listen up. and it's like, it was just this interesting thing. It was like, so the angel himself enjoyed the message. And that's what made him such a good herald, because he had an investment in the message too. So
God
anyways,
was sharing, his power, his allowing this angel the ability to participate. I think that's also a wonderful sign, a wonderful message right there.
yeah.
Anyway.
Awesome.
Well, my gosh, it's been almost 2 hours.
It's been a fun conversation. And for those listening now or listening later, either way, tomorrow, my podcast, Genesis Marks the Spot, I will have a conversation with Mike Chu here. It's going to be a Christmas message, and I'm excited to have that out for you all too. So you can all check that out at Genesis Marks the Spot. And I wish everybody a Merry Christmas and all of that. Yeah. Thanks again, guys.
Have a good night.
Yeah. Good night, everyone.